Okay, popcorn will be on the way, I have been told, but I don't know for sure. So, let's start with the movie, please.
Yeah, this boat here I was building, but the storm broke it up on me, and I can't see good anymore, so I don't think I'll be able to finish it. I had the sails on it and everything, but the storm broke it up on me. That was Katrina. Katrina. That's what happened to it. I got this little boat on my lap, but I want to show you the big boat I got. I got one 67 feet on it in the yard. Almost finished. But I don't know if I can finish it because I can't see anymore. The strongest boat I've ever built. It'll last 200, 300 years if you take care of it. My daddy built boats. My daddy was a boat builder.
My husband, Joseph, was building this boat for 30 some more years, but he built boats all his life. And this here boat, we thought he'd have it finished and had it in the water, but my daughter passed away and he got depressed and he stopped. Now that he's older, he started it again, but he can't see. He's gone blind, but he'd love to get it in the water.
But I'm gonna try the best, let's put it that way. And if I can get my eyes, that's it. I don't need no help. I can do it by myself. You got to be smart to build a boat like that, without no blueprints or nothing. And you got to watch when I throw that boat how pretty it's going to be and how fast it's going to run, the way it's built.
We hoping that it gets in the water this year, you know, before another hurricane comes. We'd like to see it back in the water.
That you can't count on. You don't know what's going to happen in life.
Waukesha is 30 miles from New Orleans. It's outside of the levees. And it's at the end, I would say the end of the world, because that's where it's at. You can't go no further. It's just water around us. My family's been here for a lot of generations, and we've seen a lot of changes in time. Before we had a nice wilderness, now we don't have that anymore. Water comes in too fast now. When I was small, every time they had a little storm, we never left. And then the storm started getting worse. They were getting tougher, you know? And Katrina was the worst we had. Katrina wiped them out. I mean, completely wiped them out. It looked like they threw a bomb here. When we came home, no houses. You know how, I mean, it's just like they threw a bomb and everything exploded, you know what I mean? They never had nothing. Katrina took everybody's house. I mean, everybody. And they didn't even want to come back. They never had nothing to come back to. They never even had a house. All their stuff was gone. They didn't even know where it went. It just went off. You know, there's not a piece of evidence of anything. It just all went away. Our house floated. You know what I mean? It was just like a boat. And it just floated away. It didn't break up like the other houses because It was well built. My husband and his daddy built this house. The boat stood here. It did not move. It was tied down well, and it stood here. I didn't even want to go in the house. I didn't even want to look at it, you know. So they emptied it out over where it was, 350 feet from here. They emptied it all out. They brought back the shell. We worked hard for this house. It was started in 48. 47, the foundation was started, but in 48, they was building it. When we first built this house, it was like 5 feet off the ground.
That's what it was.
And then we raised it, you know, 8 feet off the ground, and it still wasn't high enough. But now it's about 15 feet off the ground. So we're really up there. If a storm comes now, and we get that much water, everybody better leave, you know, because I know New Orleans would get water again. This is what happens when you forget your photos. The mistake was, when we left for Hurricane Katrina, we picked up the wrong album. We had an empty one and a full one, and we took the empty one and left the full one back. We left a lot of stuff back. Now I have a backpack, and what I do is I put all my pictures in here. This time I'm not gonna forget them. I'm gonna have them with me all the time. And I got all my pictures in here that we had. We got pictures of my husband and I when he was going overseas in World War II. This is me when I was about 6 months old. And this is when we had our 50th anniversary. I didn't care too much about having anything because I had just lost my daughter. She had died. And this picture is my 3 kids when they were small. I thought I lost it for the hurricane, and somebody got in the attic and they brought the box down. And I was amazed to see that we had our picture, you know, of the kids when they were small. I have Spencer, I have Richard, and Joylyn. She was a little baby. I don't have too many pictures of her, you know. But I was so glad. I even cried when I got this picture. I really did. So this picture must be about 60-some-odd years old. You know, it's a long time. That's one thing you can't do. You can't replace what you lost, you know? And this is memories, good memories.
Named after my daughter, Joylyn. There's a second boat she had that I had on her name. And we had a lot of good luck with the boat. It was a trophy winner, little Joylyn. I think she's still living, you know. Feel like it. Because I had bought our house. This was the house. Our house over here belonged to her. I wanted buying it again.
5 generations will be here tomorrow. All my grandkids, and my great-grandkids, and my great-great-grandkids. I'm gonna be 71 years married tomorrow. We're gonna have a big shrimp boil, and then we're gonna have a cake, and we have a friend of ours that he's gonna come and give us our vows again, you know, asking us why we married 71 years, what's ahead of the future. I said, we married too long. 71 years. So we're gonna have a big celebration. It's gonna be like Katrina. It's gonna be big.
Uncle Charlie. Aunt Sally, you know Aunt Sally, grandma's sister.
That's my nephew.
Joseph, when you first saw Selena across the bayou, what were your thoughts? I mean, did you think right then when you saw her that you wanted to marry her?
Yes. She was beautiful.
After all these years, I guess I'll stick with you.
We have one thing left to do. That is to look at each other, hold each other's hand, and say, I love you.
I love you.
I love you too, and I hope that we have many more years together.
And you may kiss the bride.
Please. Did everybody both cry and laugh like I did? Well, 71 years married, talking about sustainability. I'm going to please ask Zack to talk to us a little bit about the movie.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming. This is great to see all y'all here, and thanks for having me. And to the crew that staged this event, thank y'all, Javier and the rest of the BK crew. So this film came about from some time that I'd been making other films in Louisiana in the area. I made a movie in New Orleans after Katrina, and we filmed some in this area called Waikloski, which is a small, you can see it, it's a very small fishing village just way down outside of all the levees. We call them levees, but here you call them dikes, but it's the same, more or less the same idea. So this is outside of all the protective levees that prevent flooding. And so I got really interested in that area just because it was a lot of fishermen, and it was living life in a different way. And I got kind of interested in that, and I made another film in a similar town in another part of Louisiana that was also outside this levee protection area. And then for the 10th anniversary of Katrina, this small crew of producers in New Orleans teamed up with Time magazine to put together this series of short films that was to be for the 10th anniversary. And so that's how I'd met the Gonzaleses before through my kind of explorations down there, and I thought they were really wonderful. And I was with my soon-to-be wife, who's here in the audience with us, Jillian, and we visited the Gonzaleses, and we thought maybe this would be a good film. Jill is also a filmmaker, so together we went and visited them, and I think when we left, we both kind of started crying because it was just so powerful. And just because they're so open-hearted and generous, and so we got to make this film. So anyhow, that's how it came about, and we filmed it in the summer of 2015, and then the film was done in a matter of 2 months or something like this. And it was premiered for the anniversary of Katrina, which is in August, at the end of August. And so it was 10th anniversary, played online in a lot of places, and then went on to play at a lot of film festivals. And people still want to see it. So this is really nice to be able to share that here. So thank you all for watching it, and I'm happy to talk more about it. Sadly, the Gonzaleses now, so that was 10 years ago, 11 years ago almost when we filmed it, and they've since passed on. Joseph, I think, died a couple years later, and then Selena just passed away this past year. So, but they're we're wonderful people, and the boat still, as far as I know, is sitting in the yard. But I think they've kind of tried to convert it into like maybe some kind of living arrangement. So maybe it's like an apartment or something like that, so people can live in there. And maybe it's like an Airbnb or something. I'm not exactly sure, but it was never ever able to go into the water. He was never able to finish it. And actually, come to find out, like finishing a boat like that costs a lot of money. It's not just a matter of making sure that it can float, but there's a lot of electrical work and all that kind of stuff. And it just was going to be a lot more labor than any one person could do.
Thank you very much, Zach. It's a beautiful story. A house that is floating, built like a boat, so fantastic from an architectural perspective. An actual boat on the side of the house, probably been turned into an Airbnb. And indeed, very heartwarming stories. And you both being there and actually finding an appropriate way to tell these stories to a wider public. So with this note, we're going to ask Janina, who is an expert on storytelling, as I already said, to actually come along and tell us how is she approaching storytelling from her perspective, and give us a little bit of a small pitch in relation to the topics of this BK talk. Yes, please. Here she is.
Well, I feel a bit sort of awkward coming after this beautiful sort of story full of emotion, and now this sort of 5 dry slides that explain what I have to do with water and storytelling. So my apologies. Someone has to do this bridge away from this beautiful narrative. But I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel. And when I was sort of preparing these 5 slides that you're about to see, I thought really all paths have led me to be here tonight, This is this moment. Because what you're seeing on the screen right now is my master graduations project at St. Lucas in Brussels in 2006. I felt very bad that 20 years ago I was graduating. But at the time that I was doing my graduation project, there was a lot to do around the Sigma and Delta plans in the Low Countries, which were to sort of protect the Low Countries from flooding. And I thought, okay, for my graduation project, I'll contribute to this. So what you're seeing here is a sort of levee, but sculptural landscape levee that I designed for the city of Antwerp, where I'm living. And it's a sort of 4.5 kilometer stretch. And for those of you who know Antwerp, it goes from the island in the north to sort of New South. And then funnily, a few years after I completed my master's project, which is sort of this landscape scheme for this sculptural levee that tried to maintain the relation between the city and the water, because this levee was to be 3 meters, and right now there's a wall that is 1 meter, and they were to raise it by 2 meters, and I thought we want to keep that connection. Anyway, a project that looks very similar to this one is now under construction, so I'm very suspicious what happened there, but anyway, so that was my first encounter with water. And then after I studied architecture, I sort of got the urbanism bug, and I embarked on another degree in what was then called human settlements. And also here, sort of water and floods remained a central focus. And together with 3 people who were at the University of Leuven in Belgium, where I was doing this work, with the university staff, I edited my first book, which is this book, which appeared in 2008, Water Urbanisms. And this book was sort of inspired by many of these sort of floods, like Hurricane Katrina, that had happened by this point in time. And this book posits that sort of water is reconquering the contemporary agenda for urbanism, and that this renewed focus for urbanists is not uncalled for, but the disappearance sort of water in urban considerations in the 19th and 20th century, that is what is remarkable. I'm not going to read you the whole sort of summary of the book, but I don't know if it's here in the library, but if you're interested, you can go and have a look, or you can ask me if you're interested, if it's not in the library. So again, water was a sort of key focus in my work, and then I shifted a bit, and that's where the storytelling then arrives. So in 2019, when I'd been in academia for some time, I started questioning what stories we tell when we talk about architecture and the built environment more broadly, and whose voices we hear when we are telling stories. So then together with 2 colleagues from Australia, I developed this book, Speaking of Buildings, Oral History and Architectural Research. And this book really started from the premise that architecture scholars tend to use text, drawings, and photographs to craft narratives, and that oral history is rarely sort of taken seriously. And when it is, we tend to just talk to the architects, but not other people. That's what I was noticing in this kind of scholarship. So with this book, we wanted to examine how other voices could be heard and sort of look at this radical potential of this research method that had historically been cast as subjective, inexpert, partial, and unreliable. And one of the things that we put forward in this book, that if you use other methods, such as storytelling, oral histories, you should also think carefully about the formats of your output. So basically, we concluded that if you do interviews, maybe it shouldn't end up in a sort of written text, maybe like a documentary film like yours or a podcast. But then, ironically, we still publish this as a book. But what working on this oral history book taught me is that there is a sort of strong correlation between how we know and what we know. And this invited me to reflect on sort of the correlation also that exists between the methods that we use and the formats that we adopt, the outputs that we create. So I began to think, like, if methods create worlds, which worlds do we want to create, and how can we make these worlds accessible to various audiences? And that's why when I arrived in Delft, 2021, I set up this research seminar, which is called Building Stories, stolen from Chris Ware's wonderful graphic novel collection. And in this research seminar, students are asked to sort of use fictocriticism to produce graphic novel short stories about urban design projects of their choosing, and to test if through this approach, through these graphic novel short stories, we can actually come to other stories about the built environment that might otherwise not be told. And I've brought one example that was produced last year by Hester Jans, who followed the course. And I chose this example because it sort of brings together water and storytelling. And I'm not going to read it out. It's going to appear on the screen. It's going to slide over the screen. And you can read what the river has to say in this next slide. So I hope it's legible.
Where is this taking place? Where is this story taking place?
This is, it should stay there on the Chongyen. Oh, no, I forget. It's in Asia, but I forget.
Okay. Okay.
This is this very famous project in Asia, in Seoul. Seoul, yeah.
Thank you very much, Janina. I actually happen to know the project, and I have actually, yes, visited, and it is indeed a big issue about bringing it back clean, the water in the very dense city of Seoul, and the stories related. Thank you very much. And before we start the conversation, we have one more pitch, this time coming from an environmental perspective, if I may say so. Jelmer Teunissen.
Teunissen.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for trying.
Please. Here you are.
Okay. I'm a bit wary to say I'm an environmental expert. I am a graduate here in architecture. I graduated in 2024. So first of all, thanks. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I've been in the audience here many a time. So it's really an honor to be here in this capacity. So I graduated here in 2024 with a project called Muddying the Waters Wetland Communization in Deltaic Ruins. And you see some excerpts of it on the screen. The project dealt with a contested and polluted wetland in Rotterdam that is currently threatened by waterfront development. And the design is a proposed transformation of a site for the transshipment of sand into a prefigurative infrastructure that would advance wetland material culture and thereby centering wetland spaces that are currently perceived as marginal. And the project was shown in Archipres, so that meant that I was occupied with it for another year. So I only very recently left this project behind a little bit. And then I'll tell you a bit about my current practice. Part of it is working as a spatial designer in the Dutch cultural sector. So I design exhibitions for museums, mostly art spaces, sometimes installations for artists. And this has been, all comes from a collaboration with Setare Nourani that started in 2020. So I did this next to my master's, and now after my master's, the image on the bottom right is an exhibition that just opened in Wereldmuseum Leiden. And I'd say it's mandatory viewing for all Dutch people. It's on West Papua. West Papua used to be a Dutch colony, so not many people know about it. And it's a beautiful, I shouldn't say it's a beautiful exhibition, but the objects there are beautiful. We really tried our best. It's been an honor to work with the West Papuan community and the team at Wereldmuseum. And in this line of work, we tell stories through space and the use of material, staging. And that's one way I deal with stories. It's also a wonderful way to work because you can try out a lot of things very quickly. And what else can I say about this? Yeah, it's I guess it's quite intense. Composing stories in the sort of fast-paced museum cycle, and we try to take great care to really give everything the space and the staging that it should have, and it's always a challenge, and every time it's different. And then another part of my practice is as an independent researcher, and in this capacity, I worked for the past year on a project called Atelier Delta 2100, and I've worked there. I was brought in as an ateliermeester together with Dirk Simons and Lodewijk van Nieuwenhuizen to landscape architecture grades who did a lot to advance different nature-based perspectives into regional planning and Dutch landscape architecture. And we worked on behalf, the project was organized by the International Architecture Biennale Rotterdam, and we worked on behalf of several governments, and in light of the Delta program, and it centered on long-term perspectives for water safety for the region of Rijnmond-Drechtstede, which is the region around Rotterdam. Focusing on scenarios with 2+ meters of sea level rise. And I also served as the final editor of the final report, and it will be published later this month. So keep posted. The research was executed by the Urbanisten HNS landscape architects and Pozat Max One. I cannot share the results yet, sadly, because it's yet to be published, but very soon. And then I wanted to tell you, well, basically a few stories. As an independent researcher, I try to focus on, find stories that are hidden, tell stories about lost landscapes, lost practices, because the world is changing very quickly, and if we're not aware of our past, and erasing entire wetland geographies sort of has a amnesiac effect, then how can we move into the future? So the first story is about beaver in the Netherlands. It's basically a genealogy of human-beaver relations in the Netherlands, and it's more a story about us polder dwellers by way of beaver. I got interested in beaver because of their notoriety as saboteurs of our primary infrastructure. And I asked what we could learn from tracing the lineages of these relations. And I was completely surprised that they were possibly the reason that people first settled this region in the post-glacial period thousands of years ago, as they promoted wetland heterogeneity and riverine heterogeneity across landscape scales. So people really, oh, can I go back? Yeah. People came here because of the beaver landscapes that were here. So they lived off the beaver commons, they attuned their lifeways to the affordances that beavers created for them. And beavers were really part of their cultural or eco-cultural identities. And this shifted, these relations shifted over time into agro-pastoral periods, and then later in the pre-Roman era, the beaver were commodified and then later eradicated, and eventually they went extinct in the industrializing modernity. These shifts took place over millennia, but they can be observed sort of at high speed in the Dutch colonial endeavors. So Manhattan, for example, was first a Dutch outpost to protect the beaver pelt trade. And there you can very clearly observe that beaver eradication and the drainage of wetlands sort of went hand in hand. They were, different sides of the same coin. And served to bring these, bring hydropower under control of the Dutch. And then beavers were reintroduced in the 1980s. And this is, on the left, you see a map of the current spread of beavers. And on the right, you can see a map of all the primary infrastructure in the Netherlands, including dikes and train lines. And, there's a lot of talk about what do we do with the beavers, because they're a protected species, and they're often cast as a problem animal. So their repeat offenders are executed, and despite ambitions of biodiversity, one water manager said, beavers can't be in primary infrastructure, and everything in South Holland is primary infrastructure. So the beaver can tell us a lot. Beaver can tell us a lot about us, polder dwellers. Their total disregard of our way of ordering the world can help us question that order. So in these lowlands, beaver figure as ontological mutineers, figures of friction who point towards systemic factors by ornamenting the cracks, who show us our lines never truly connect and everything is only partial. If we have time, I can tell one more.
How do you feel? You want one more? Yes, here's your answer.
Was that a yes?
I think
okay.
So.
This photo is one I encountered in the archives of the Frisian Museum It's a picture of terp excavators, so dwelling mound excavators. These men are, I think it's around 1905, a glass plate print. These are workers who work on the excavation of terp earth, which was, or dwelling mound earth, which was recognized as especially fertile in a period when artificial fertilizer wasn't readily available yet. And this earth was then taxed, and that meant a lot of people who lived on them had to sort of sell their terps, first by the square meter, then by the cubic meter. And it was shipped off to the Dutch wastelands to make, like, mostly raised bogs, to make these territories also productive. And eventually, you know, while during these excavations, many archaeological finds were done, but they were sort of discarded. This pre-Roman heritage wasn't really valued, and then at some point, at the end of the 19th century, a professor stepped in and said, "Oh, you know, really, we can construct prehistory of the Netherlands here." And then the archaeological methods that they used were actually based on the way that these terps were excavated, so with vertical slicing rather than horizontal slicing. And the picture that has emerged in the meantime, and especially also in recent decades, was that these weren't primitive or poor people as the Romans cast them, but really these were, you know, one of the richest regions in these parts of Europe, and with some of the highest densities of population, and they held the land in common. And they, you know, they participate in supra-regional trade, and yeah, most strikingly, they lived with the tides coming in twice per day. And then this is an impression of Poverty Point in Louisiana. We're just talking about it. I suppose, you know, it's slightly different periods, but these societies, these wetland societies in the Mississippi Delta and the Rhine watershed can really be compared, or the intertidal regions of the North Sea can really be compared to an extent. And then one last fragment of a story is about the wetland material cultures that survived until just after the war, the Second World War. This is an image of a grindwerkershut, which is a hut on a willow stand. Willow was really used for the entire prehistory and history in the Netherlands. So this is, for example, a fishing trap, and also the insides of a dike are built with willow stakes. This is a map of the willow stands. I think in the 1950s there were thousands of hectares. It was actually at the height of willow culture, and then very rapidly it declined, and now only a couple hectares are left. For example, a map of the willow stands in the Biesbos. And yeah, I found these pictures by going through regional archives, and they're quite striking as a sort of remnants of you know, wetland material cultures that survived until so recently. And this was before the invention of the motor-powered boat. So people used to have to row to these quite remote locations and stay there, and these buildings. And then before, you know, the Petrocene, people used to weave with these materials for, you know, all kinds of purposes, basketry, etc. And then they are also used to build dikes and other infrastructures. So in a sense, the diking and the you know, the territorialization of floodplains, of intertidal regions, was possible with the use of willow, and then it also was the cause of its own decline. This is for the Nieuwe Waterweg. These infrastructures get used on a huge scale, and then this is for the Nieuwe Maasvlakte 2. So they're still in use, and yeah, I think this is just a wonderful picture, and I'd like to end with this.
Thank you very much, Jelmer. If I may ask a kind round of applause for the beautiful contributions by Janina and Jelmer, just to warm up the atmosphere. Thank you very much. Before we start the conversation, thank you, the audience, very, very much. I would like to start with something as being in the very beautiful position of observing the stories and the people and the issues you bring on the table. There is an underlying common thread that I would like to put on the table, and feel free to disagree with me or to comment on it. And in some way or another, all three of you, through your respective ways of engaging with the world out there, you are actually saying that you're taking a position. I don't know to what degree this is a personal position or a more ethical position and a more critical position of deciding what kind of stories you are bringing outside to a wider audience. And this can maybe starting by saying, okay, I visited with my wife at the time and we really felt emotionally, it was a wonderful story to tell. But at the same time, behind the personal, there is the stories of people who are resisting a particular way of life in the urban centers and consciously choosing for generations to stay outside the levees without whatever consequences that means. People that are not officially, architectures that are not officially studied in schools of architecture, okay, or buildings. And there's this unsung people, as you say. You are actually making a decision of saying, okay, all these kind of narratives that have been for years been disregarded as subjective, as not valuable, as non-scientific, I'm going to bring it into the scientific conversation, and I'm also going to make a stance by saying the best way possible is podcasters, the best way possible is other ways of talking about these stories, not necessarily books or writings. And also you're making the decision about saying, you very beautifully put it, we are trying to actually make the best possible to give people the space and the stage that is most appropriate for them, the objects that you brought from the colony, of course, the beaver or the excavators. So you're all in some way with your work bringing to all our attention and to the wider audiences with which you're engaging stories that are not part of the big narratives, stories that are non-known, stories that in the wider Anthropocene and in the wider notion of beyond the human are actually enriching very actively this conversation. And I wanted to ask how much this is a personal drive, how much is this an ethical stand, how much you're positioning yourselves in relation to this question. You're making decisions by the stories you're bringing into the conversation. And behind the stories, there are much bigger stories. Why and how? If these are not big enough questions.
Yeah, very kind of difficult question to answer, but I'll give it a shot, is that, so my background is really writing, photography, and then eventually filmmaking. And so I have always tried to listen to that little voice in my head or something like that. You know, it's not a really quantifiable thing, but it's kind of like whenever I feel, you know, oh, I'm really attracted to this place, or I'm really attracted to the Gonzaleses, you know. And once I meet them, it's like, wow, I want other people to meet them. And it's just a really strong feeling to where it becomes undeniable, and it just has to happen. And the way that a film gets made, a film is kind of complicated to make. You know, I don't want to compare it to creating a building, but you know, it does require quite a few people to get involved. You know, it starts with an idea, you know, but then it does grow, and a team has to be assembled. There's equipment that has to be purchased or borrowed, and you have to know how to use certain software and all this kind of stuff, which is can be cumbersome. And so it's making a film can be fun, but it also can be kind of cumbersome is the best way to say it. And so it's that's what I mean. When I have that feeling that's undeniable, all that cumbersomeness is worth it. And so that's what propels it on. And once I kind of tell the Gonzaleses or whomever I'm making a film with, like, hey, I want to make a film with you, there's no turning back at that point. I just have to go ahead and go forward with it. But yeah, so I have over the years thought about what is the kinds of stories or, you know, people, characters, what have you, that I'm attracted to. And, you know, of course, I'm in the, I mean, as Angeliki mentioned, I got this grant to come here to the Netherlands. So I have to find a way to articulate this kind of stuff. And I imagine you'll face that soon enough yourselves, but like you have to find a way to articulate what is it that you're attracted to. And so I have had to kind of self-analyze that a little bit and not just rely on the answer like, well, I just am, you know. So it is hard to talk about, but it is something that is maybe it is kind of like maybe I've witnessed something that a lot of my friends haven't witnessed, or that maybe the wider public hasn't witnessed, and maybe by seeing this kind of corner over here that's been kind of overlooked, we might understand a shared experience, and actually feel a connection to that thing that would be otherwise, other or underseen or unseen. And Jelmer, you said something earlier about these forgotten histories, or these histories that have been buried or suppressed intentionally or unintentionally. And I was going to ask you the question, which is, what is the value, in your words, of like bringing to light these buried histories or these buried stories? Because I think that's part of the greater project of what I'm doing here. Is the project is called What the River Says. So obviously we're going into kind of uncharted territory, talking about the river speaking, So that means that we're having to learn to listen in a different way. And so that might mean uncovering a story that's been, buried. So I was just kind of curious. I don't know if you want to move it along over here.
Yeah. Maybe I can go back to this. I just finished my pitch, but I forgot to say that the location of this hut it's buried somewhere under 6 meters of sand under Europort. So in the post-war period, the harbor expansion and really the river streamlining and using the river as an infrastructure for the fossil fuel industry really eradicated a lot of these practices, these places, these wetlands. And I stumbled on this story, and there's so many stories about this specific harbor development, but this one just sort of transports you back in time. And I think there's, like I alluded to, there's a kind of amnesia, the flatland of the polder, sort of hides that the plenty is plunder. There's been so many species, practices, people suppressed to come to the state that we find ourselves in now, and it's a very, very fragile state. And I first started getting interested in this really out of concern of, the prospect of practicing architecture in Rotterdam, and being concerned with housing justice. And then, looking into, or I think at the time some reports came out about sea level rise, and it was just like, okay, how are we dealing with this in terms of housing? So it was a very practical question. And I'm always sort of, I don't know, it's just my proclivity to sort of question assumptions. And I noticed that, the assumptions that had been used in Dutch environmental science were different from the ones that were used in the IPCC. And I noticed the trend that it's always more and it's always earlier in these predictions. And that just, sort of ignited something in me that I really wanted to tell stories about climate change. But then the fixity of the polder and the sort of, the fact that you're behind a dike and that's sort of an immovable thing, sort of bars us from really reflecting on what it means to live in a climate-changed world, And it's a different kind of culture than I think the calculation is the risk equals damages times likelihood or something in water management, and the likelihood is supposed to be very low here, but it means that if it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. It's one big connected bathtub, and. So to be able to reflect on what it really means, I've been to wetlands elsewhere in the world, and there you get really the sense of the water is an actor here, and here it's been so controlled that it becomes either a useful thing or a beautiful thing, but never something you truly live with as part of your life, or at least not anymore. So I started just digging for stories to reconnect ourselves to that reality, and. yeah, to sort of, also show that it wasn't a given that we ended up where we are now. That these are stories of struggle, stories of violence, and that we shouldn't forget these struggles, and that there are many more struggles to come.
Thank you very much, Jelmer. Very beautiful to hear that in a country surrounded by water and water everywhere, we still don't consciously live with water. Another untold thing. Janina, if you want to comment on this idea of what stories we are bringing forward, what is the responsibility?
Well, for me, this was really sort of like an ethical decision in the sense that when I was doing my PhD, I sort of naturally went to talk to the users of buildings and the people who did the maintenance of buildings. And this was, I really didn't think that this was an odd thing to do. It wasn't until I started looking into how oral history and interviews were used in architecture that I thought, others have been talking to architects. So I thought, this is strange. And I really got to notice this when I worked on a research project in Australia where I was told, like, you have to go and talk to architects. And these stories were very different from the stories I'd sort of gathered during my PhD because the architects, they wanted to, come across very well, have their projects featured in a very good way. And you come to stories that sort of are a bit, repeated and often repeated to various people. I thought maybe these are not the most interesting stories. And also personally, I mean, a good bit of gossip is really interesting about a building. This is what interests you. Gossip is sort of, the sort of, everyday stories that you say, oh, do you know this happened in that building? These are really interesting stories. But for me, it was also really ethical to think like we're as architects or urban designers, we are designing for people. And in the end, of course, the architects and designers put a lot of care into buildings, but then caring for these buildings subsequently, other people do that. And that is also what I wanted to bring to the fore. Now, at the same time, I also have to say, working on the oral history book, I also really got to understand that some stories are really not ours to tell, because many people were sort of working with indigenous communities, where storytelling, of course, plays an important role. I'm looking at Greg, and then you think, okay, but who can tell these stories? Should we be telling these stories? Should other people be telling these stories? So I don't think that all stories are ours to tell, and I think you have to carefully reflect on that. And then you could also ask, okay, the river speaks, but who can speak for the river? Because in various places, I'm rambling a bit, but in various places, rivers have been given personhood. And the question is, okay, who can speak for the river? Because, okay, What the River Says is a beautiful title, but the river can't speak. So we have to also think carefully what stories we want to bring to the fore to allow the river to speak in a certain way. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, this is answering wonderfully the question, and you're not rambling at all, because indeed I wanted to actually as well ask, what does the river say after all? And what are we expecting the river to say by the end of, let's say, this Fulbright visit here? Because all three of you, in the stories you are selecting and the stories you are saying, you're beautifully combining the very personal stories, the very personable connection with the one-to-one, with your characters, with the beaver, with the people who are doing the care and the care of the building, the cleaners. But also there's a level of infrastructure, and you're also, in a way, talking about the level of this infrastructure, which is a very mega level scale. We know Katrina happened because of infrastructure issues, and in your other movies, this is part of the story. You were talking about how this infrastructure has come along. You looked into the people who create all this infrastructure. So you're combining these two big, very diverse scales that, if I'm a bit daring to say, is not something we often, or is not the mainstream conversation in design schools. I'm sorry to say, and if people in the audience have complaints about this statement, we can discuss further. But in a design studio, this is not necessarily right away we're discussing. Not necessarily we're going directly to the people. There's a general user in the majority of the studios. Neither we're going directly to the infrastructure. So how is this coming along? What difficulties are you encountering? And what do you manage to say? Where you think you can take the conversation by bringing together these two diverse scales? If this is a question that makes sense to you. And what is the river going to say at the end, after all this infrastructure that has changed the river, and who is going to be your character? I have more difficult questions in my armory. Janina, you want to start?
Who creates who looks at the infrastructural scale? Well, good question. I don't know what the river would say. When you were sort of asking this question, what came to mind? Well, I'm a slow thinker. I'm still thinking of what the river says. And a book that came to mind is Mississippi Floods, which is a beautiful book that sort of looks how the Mississippi River sort of changed course over time. Also affected by infrastructural works that happened. But bridging the scales, I don't think I really ever really looked at the large infrastructure scale apart from my master's project, which I think was wildly ambitious and wildly inappropriate because it should have really created wetlands. So it's from a very sort of human-centered perspective that this design was made. And I think now we're sort of reaching a stage, as you were showing the beaver and how the beaver is sort of attacking the infrastructure kind of, and that's becoming a problem. I think it's becoming an awareness that looking at infrastructure, you can do that in different ways. It doesn't necessarily need to be sort of from the big scale of what it does for a bigger region, but also through the story of the beaver or the story of, there was some research that I came across recently where they created a wetland that was also sort of like purifying water outside of Stockholm. And this story was told through the person who physically has to go there every day, open the sluice, sort of close or open something so it can flow into a different area, and sort of from the story of the maintenance. So I think the infrastructure, I don't think it's necessarily sort of big scale, small scale. I think there is ways of marrying these perspectives depending on which viewpoint you adopt to look at it.
Super. Yeah. Thank you. You also brought in the issue of, that we have to find new ways of listening. So maybe this is an additional parameter that you would like maybe to comment. Zach, Jelmer, whatever.
Sure. I was going to say that the title, it comes from a poem, What the River Says, American poet William Stafford. And obviously it's personifying, giving the river personhood in a certain sense, that the river can actually speak. It's a provocative idea. And I think that's what I liked about it, is not necessarily that the river is going to actually say something, obviously, not in that kind of speaking way. But, and then I'm not going to speak for the river, but it is provocative that you are going to ask that question. What would the river say? What might the river say? If the river could speak, what would it say? What would he say? What would she say? What would they say? You know, what would the... And then now you're thinking about something, you're thinking about this experience quite differently, and it does kind of play into this movement that is happening around the world, which is the rights of rivers and giving rivers autonomy in this kind of sense. So now we're in this other way of thinking, okay? So that's where I wanted to just kind of nudge us with this project. And so I don't have an answer for what the river says, and I wouldn't presume otherwise. So I'll just say that, and then we can kind of come back to that if we want.
Yeah, in Rotterdam, everybody always refers to the river, you know, and there's actually many. Yeah, I have to say that, you know, reading about the becoming of the river as we find it now, and comparing it to other cases, I found that, you know, a river, as you know, it's perceived here is not necessarily the same as a river elsewhere. So here you could say, you know, the Nieuwe Maas is, if we're talking about the Nieuwe Maas, which I frequently am, is a comparatively biotically dead, channelized, you know, artificially deepened, broadened to accommodate for the largest ships in the world. And a river, you know, if you look at very old maps of Rotterdam, it's kilometers wide, and it's not really a river, it's more like a forest. I think the river, the Nieuwe Maas, used to be called Merwede, and Merwede is a word that refers to, in the form miriwido, to a forested or a wet forest. I mean, that's some theories. With linguistics, it's also it's always a bit speculative. But if the river that we now find as a river, which is really a channel, used to be a forest, then we have to question what river we really encounter when we go for a walk along the river. A long-winded way of saying that there's a certain sort of epistemological condition, maybe the ontological condition that we find ourselves in, where we see what is static and controlled and give it a name, but refuse to recognize that there's a past where we went about our lives in this place for very different reasons, with very different reasonings, and we would have not called the river that we would have encountered wasn't the same thing at all. It was dynamic, it was moving. I really like, for example, I think it really opened some sort of registers to think with d'Acunha's and Matour's work on wetness, and I think thinking with wetlands is a way to think also about possible futures, the generative eco-tones that exist between dry and wet, and the sort of categories of dry and wet also, they are mirrored in categories of dirty and clean and all different sort of divisionary boundaries that exist in our lives. So when I really listen to these sort of stories, when I encounter them, this is what I think about. And let's keep it at that.
Yes.
I think that's
Zack,
yes.
Please, Zack.
Yeah, sure. So that brings up a thing that I would like to add to that, which is if you're thinking about what the river says, okay, back to that idea, you do have to kind of ask, what is the river, and so then you start looking at, so these rivers that have been altered, of course, for over the years, become the river, so to speak. But if you again looking into these histories that have been, in a certain sense, I would say forgotten, but not totally forgotten, but in a certain sense, like kind of out of sight, out of mind. Then you start bringing them back into the light of day, and now the river has a different persona, a little bit, and harder to define. Part of that idea of the river is that line on the map, and where the properties that are along that river and ownership of those properties along the river, and then suddenly the river becomes defined, and you have to make sure it doesn't flood and all of these kind of things, and then the river becomes something different, but over time the river has been many things. So and I think part of that book that you're referring to, d'Acunha, so that part of the river is it's a continuous cycle. So where do you distinguish the rain from the mud and this kind of part? So
very nice. I'm going to ask, divert a little bit the conversation and ask a question about storytelling a little bit as a tool, because we're all working with that. And I'm going to, if you allow me, bring a little bit of a personal interest. I work a lot with literature, and I'm currently working, I'm touching on what you say, story, of course, as a possibility of imagining the futures. I'm reading recently the latest novel by Ian McEwan, who is a UK-based novelist, and he's imagining a story taking place 100 years from now. So imagine that we are in 2126. There is an academic like Janina who loves looking into archives and research, and this academic is doing research on a poem that was once recited, has never been put down in writing, in a dinner, and this academic is looking on all the possible archives, and because he's looking back in 2026, he has access to all social media feeds, to all WhatsApp chats, everything, emails, and he's actually looking on all this material from all the people around the dinner that heard the poem, and through gossip as well, he's trying to reconstruct the poem. And by discussing, his biggest difficulty is actually being able to travel to an archive because the sea has risen, and it's really difficult to make this trip, really dangerous, and there's no possibility to actually fly because of the environmental crisis that has happened. And one of the things that the book communicates and the characters in 100 years from now communicate is their absolute amazement in how much we knew as a society in 2026 about the climate change and how little we did. This is like throughout the whole novel and makes me like stresses me as I keep reading this super interesting story. So I'm asking how much trust you have in the possibility of storytelling as a tool to actually prevent what we're all afraid, and is really dealt a lot in many of our studios and many of our students, to actually we're all afraid is going to happen. We keep talking about the rising of the water, we keep talking about the climate changes, we keep talking about the south countries of Europe, the summers getting hotter and hotter, and all of you are dealing with stories of very specific people here and there, the beaver. How much trust do you have in storytelling as a capacity to actually fight what is happening or what we think is happening and we're afraid is happening?
I just was going to, just real quick, well, anyway, if you want to say something, you should.
No, go ahead.
Okay,
go ahead.
Is that there's been plenty of calls around for better stories about our, situation regarding the climate. So better climate stories, and then also a better grand narrative. And I don't know. I don't have that. I don't know that. But there's many of these, going around. There's also. I think I'd read something the American writer Rebecca Solnit had said that there's too many horrible stories, and the more horrible stories that we're surrounded with, that just really is going to just beat everybody down to kind of depression in a certain sense, a kind of helplessness. And so, not necessarily that we need to tell cheery stories, but what are the stories that actually are not going to be just complete, doom. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know what that story is. I've heard variations on it. You probably have too. But I'll turn it over. Yeah.
I was going to say, to a certain extent, you answered your own question, I think, because I think and we've seen it, the capacity of stories is that it touches you emotionally and it brings the thing sort of, in Dutch you say, closer to your bed, that you don't think this is a far away thing. Others, governments are dealing with this. It's all good. There's reports you don't understand. Stories have the capacity to reach people emotionally, like The Boatman does. And I think then it becomes something that you care about, because you were saying this book scares me, or I'm not saying it needs to be a scary story, but they reach you in an emotional way, in a way that reports and sort of projections like +2 degrees means water level rise of this. And it's sometimes very abstract and hard to imagine, and stories can touch you in a different way, in a sort of emotional way. And this is a side note, but I want to say there's many things that I really liked about The Boatman, but the one thing that I thought was really funny, and that sort of stuck with me after I saw it for the first time, is the house floated away, but the boat stayed. And you think, this is the weirdest thing. Like, the boat was anchored and the house moved. And I thought this was just, and this is the thing when I watched it a couple of weeks ago that sort of stuck with me. And stories have this capacity to sort of lodge themselves somewhere in your brain in a way that data about climate change and water level rise just does not. Stories have that capacity, that they get into your brain somewhere and stay there, and you remember it.
It's right. It can get abstract and conceptual, and my eyes glaze over. I start to fall asleep. No matter how vital and important those numbers and statistics are, it's really hard to comprehend, and then I'll feel totally overwhelmed and absolutely helpless, and I just say, I'm never reading the news again, and then. But if you do meet with a story and then you can kind of engage with it in a kind of real life, the tangible reality, concrete reality, and that's what I can relate to. That's my experience, So.
I have a few points. It's a great question. I think just the counterexample works just as well to see what sort of silly stories make our world currently completely unbelievable. One powerful man said something somewhere and everybody moves accordingly. I would say that I keep reading these numbers and the reports and try to read the stories into them. And I feel like I have to, even though it is effectively, it's not easy. Actually, I feel like in the stories that I try to tell, I don't try to be hopeful. I don't think there's any cause for hope, but I do want to invite courage. And I feel like, there's no reason for optimism, but we have to get very good at being very pessimistic. We have to organize our pessimism. And precisely because, these stories that keep on, effectively pulling us towards, fascist futures. How it's going to be so easy in a climate-changed world, everything in disarray, to have these stories, determine our lives. That I think it's of the utmost importance that we get serious about our pessimism and really inspire courage in each other to deal with this and not sit back and do nothing.
Organize our pessimism. Okay, this is quite the idea. This is quite the initiative.
I like that.
A lot. You all brought to mind the book. I apologize sincerely for not being able to remember the name of the author, who is a Dutch philosopher. It was published a few years ago. It's called Humankind, and the way it's written is actually a word play, because humankind is all of us all around the world. But on the cover, it's written Humankind. Of course, talking about our capacity to be kind and kind to each other and how this has brought us forward, okay? And actually is making the statement, is making the argument that newspapers and the news and the statistics and the data that are meant to scare us and that we just doze over are actually representing only a tiny percentage of the non-kind humankind of the world, 2% of the non-kind people in the world, and the very violent exceptions and the very harsh things that are not what the majority of the humankind around us is actually believing in and living their lives with. And is actually making a plea of asking people to stop reading the news. Because we cannot be believing that this 2% that the news are representing is what we are all standing for and where we're all headed. So it's beautiful to, comparing that with organizing your pessimism. And since we're talking about the future, okay, as a stand, organizing the pessimism, or looking at the kindness, or looking at how we are going to approach the stories, and since we're in an educational environment, what are you advising? And I know you were just very recently in an educational environment, so if you're also teaching, I will ask you, Jelmer, what kind of stories you're expecting, you're hoping, you're advising, you're encouraging your students to say, and how? What kind of stories you think are necessary in 2026 in architectural world, in the design? What stories are necessary from maybe an environmental? The audience, a big majority of the audience are students. What stories do we hope they will bring forward that we have not thought of, that we are, as a generation, we're incapable? I'm the oldest of all, but let's say we're in the same generation. We're incapable of thinking of what stories are you hoping will come forward from your teachings, from your engagement with the newer generation? And I'm imagining a future that you're also teaching. Or you can also answer. Teaching. Perfect, wonderful.
Okay, well, I teach filmmaking and screenwriting in my university. So I do think about teaching storytelling like very much almost every day. And I believe that, I encourage my students to, they're all going to come from different perspectives with different kinds of stories, and I encourage them to tell the best story that they have, and also that sounds kind of simple, but it's actually pretty hard for them to figure that out. And then the other thing is to tell it well, and so that's kind of a classic notion, the well-told story. But I do think that this is something that a lot of younger people are really impressed by, and I see that in my students, is that they're impressed by a well-told story, because so much of the stories that are surrounding us these days are, to be honest, poorly told stories and not well put together. And so what does it mean to put something together well is actually a very great challenge. And to me, that would be something that engages the imagination, that touches the emotions, and perhaps also opens the mind or it challenges the intellect. So the emotions, imagination, and the intellect, if these three can be, if you can kind of get those three things going, then you're really doing something as a storyteller. And I really think the imagination part is a great missing element here. And I don't mean imagination necessarily like the Lord of the Rings or something like this, but just abstract, story imagination. You know, some seeing things that maybe you don't see in front of you all the time. And then to put that into a nonfiction form of storytelling is actually a great challenge, and I'm still figuring that out. But with fiction, we can already kind of move in that direction. But with nonfiction storytelling, it's about finding, I think, the dramatic elements. I mean, I use the word drama a lot, but it's about finding the dramatic elements that exist there, and then structuring the story in such a way to get the imagination engaged from the audience. And I believe that engaging the audience is of the utmost importance. So I really absolutely think this is actually comes down to all kinds of other things beyond just entertainment. But it's an ethical, political, social importance. So.
Thank you, Zach. Who wants to go next? Who would like to jump in?
I can be very brief. I fully agree. I think it's not so much about which stories, which actors, but it's about stories that sort of ask the right kinds of questions that make you reflect critically. And here I always sort of go back to, this is terrible, but sort of Foucault talks about a sort of criticism that enables sort of scintillating leaps of the imagination. And I think stories that have that kind of...
Repeat that.
Scintillating leaps of the imagination. So he talks about criticism in that way. And I think it's about asking the right kind of questions of whatever subject you're looking at, and also make sure your audience is engaged and understands why you're asking these questions. So it's not necessarily which stories, but how do you tell the stories? I think that is really more what I want to convey to the students. Yeah.
I teach art students, so it's a very different environment, but I've spent enough time here to know what it's like over here. A great teacher of mine once said that engineers solve problems and architects endlessly restage the dramaturgy of the problem. This is André Raadman. And I really feel this. I think, we have to test assumptions all the time. And I can just relate in my graduation project, I tried testing these assumptions and make them useful. So change them from your current, relation to the world. Just change the assumption, see what comes out, have it be productive for yourself, and then it will also be productive for other people, hopefully. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jelmer. It was not a coincidence that this question was opening up to the students and what we are hoping we can actually work with the students, because I would really hope that some of the students in the audience, or somebody from the audience, would please come forward and ask a question for either of our three presenters and contributors here. There are some students in the audience that will actually be working with Zack starting mid-April. We're having a studio that involves filmmaking with architecture and actually engaging characters and telling the stories of the characters as a beginning for the design, as the starting point of design. So, can I hope? Wonderful. Thank you very much. Happily. Perfect.
Thank you. First of all, very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I'm wondering about living with water, and let's say which stories or which example can we look up to? Kind of, where should we be headed, and what is the connection we should have with water?
So I don't know, but I think about this a lot, and part of it I think comes to there's.
I'm glad that you're asking more difficult questions than me. Thank you very much.
I can elaborate a little more if it's going to help. Yeah, so for example, because here in the Netherlands you mentioned that the water is very controlled, so it's not really living with water. So is there any culture that still uses water as a source of life?
I would be tempted to answer the question by way of saying the question is not how do we live with water, but how do we live with mud? Well, so just to give some context, in the Delta program, there were a couple of consortia with different strategies, water strategies for the future of the Netherlands, and at some point during the presentation, I forget who exactly it was, but somebody said, hey, but this is not all there is under the sun. We can also work with nature. And then the technical term is nature-based solutions. And per my previous answer, you would not be amiss that I'm not a fan of the word solution. And also, well, anyway, this is a perspective. So the perspective is called meegroeien, to grow with sea level rise, with land level rise. So this is a sort of, a civil engineering with mud and with natural processes. I think this is a huge sort of cultural shift that is happening in the world of water management, although it's not clear that this is going to be the outcome. And the funny thing about this is that on the one hand, there's designers, urban planners, landscape architects who are, have basically reinvented the craft for themselves with lots of love put into it, but then they make very strange bedfellows because they have to work with the dredging companies that are destroying wetlands worldwide. I have to think of, for example, Boskalis, who is wrecking coastal reefs, coastal wetlands everywhere. And then here at home, they can present their green face. And I think the urgency of the time calls that we do make these strange bedfellows, and we do learn to work with parties that we might not always, appreciate for all the work that they do. So the field, in that sense, is very muddy. And I think there's a lot of work to do. And yeah, basically, so on pessimism, this perspective to me is the only one that doesn't get me depressed. So even though it's difficult, it's maybe not. I can still move thinking about this, even though it's a difficult struggle ahead.
Janina, you would like to take a stand on the answer?
I can very briefly, because I don't think we necessarily have to look at other cultures. I think there is also growing awareness where we are now of the need to live with water. And I think there's increasingly sort of examples where people are, giving space back to the river, reintegrating water into cities. So I think we're all going to be learning that very soon, and we can also, of course, learn from other places. But I think there is now a growing awareness that water runs across many of our towns and cities in the Low Countries, and we have covered it over, and now is the time to open it up again. So I think we're going to be learning that really, really soon. And we are taking steps, I think.
Thank you. Could I please have one more question? Thank you very much. The microphone is coming. Thank you. Yes, over here. We have the lights on us, and a few more minutes, please. We cannot hear you.
Hello? Yes. Parallel question to this. So here in the Netherlands, you could probably have seen that nature has been very, let's say, beat into submission. Everything's very engineered and perfect and fit for humans. But at the same time, in Louisiana, I've seen firsthand what happens when nature is at its most wild. And I was just wondering, what is your stance on this kind of control versus freedom of nature? Do you think the Gonzalez family would prefer to live where rivers are controlled rather than free, even if it meant that bad things would happen?
think that I don't know, but a lot of people would like to live in a place that doesn't flood. But then you do have to ask, like, what are the costs and this kind of thing. And I don't know. There's a rural there. Louisiana is heavily managed, and there's plenty of protections in place and this kind of thing. And there's the Mississippi River has something like 30-foot levees on either side of it for I don't know how many hundreds of miles, and so it doesn't flood anymore at all. And so that's it used to, have seasonal, floods, and then about 100 years ago, there was a really horrible, devastating, the worst natural disaster in American history, the flood of the Mississippi River, 1927. And after that, the United States government decided to put these huge levees up for this bottom half of the river, and now it does not flood anymore at all. And that's what killed the Louisiana marsh and wetlands. And so, yeah, this control has and I say killed, Louisiana is the fastest disappearing landmass in the Western Hemisphere, I think. And so there's a real cost there to this kind of protection. And so where the Gonzaleses live, their land, as she mentioned, has been disappearing over the years. And there's been a lot of canals that have been built and dredged in throughout this marshland for shipping, is what that's for, shipping and other kinds of industries. And so those canals eventually grow, salt water comes in, and eventually that marsh can't hold land. And so anyway, it is wild in a certain sense, and yeah, hurricanes can come through and bring in big waves and storm surges and this kind of stuff, but it is all the result of a lot of alterations to the waterways that were there to protect. And so I think the irony is that all the protections then actually are the thing that kind of is killing the land, which is not funny, but it's the irony is rich. And then it also disconnects from those processes. I think that adaptability, and it's something that Jelmer was saying about, against solutions. When you have a solution, you have to kind of finalize something and concretize it and make it absolute. And if things are in flux, then you're forced to adapt and change the seasons and this kind of thing. And that maybe goes back to the question that was asked previously, is about what kind of ways to live with water. And maybe if I was going to say something else about that, it would be something about improvisation and ability to adapt and that kind of thing.
Well, with this very beautiful answer and maybe a kind of recap that stories are not solutions, but maybe ways to capture the ironies and be able to live with the ironies and be able to live with the difficulties and the pessimisms and all the dramatological elements of what makes us human and storytellers and lovers of stories. I would like to thank our three wonderful panelists. I would like to thank you all for being here today with us. A warm round of applause, please, for a beautiful conversation. And before you can all actually go and still enjoy a little bit of the wonderful March Dutch weather, just a kind reminder, I think, Jelmer, you have the pointer? Oh, wonderful. I think I can just, since we have your attention here, we can just share that in 2 weeks from now, March 31st, the next BK talk is titled Dialogues on Depletion, and actually is a talk that is going to be combined with the inauguration of the Depletion Journal. And what does it mean to design with, within, and beyond depletion, which is actually a question completely relevant and absolutely connected with the topics we discussed already today. So thank you very much. Hope to see you again on March 31st, and hope to run into you in the hallways of BK and continue these beautiful conversations. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, guys.